Hey, welcome back to another episode of Ecommerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, how you doing today?
I'm good, Nathan. It's about 2 degrees Fahrenheit up here in Canada, so I'm glad that we're recording inside.
There we go. Well, we've had a slow snow season here in Utah, but hopefully it picks up as, I love to ski and hopefully the season gets a little better. But all things are good, and I'm excited to dive in because this season we've been doing a deep dive on jewelry. We've covered some pretty cool brands. Today we've got one that I wasn't as familiar with before, but hearing their story, I'm really excited to dive in here.
Yeah, I think Aurate is one of those brands you're like, oh yeah, I do know about them, and they're quietly building something very special.
Yeah, I mean, Aurate, it's such a fascinating story. Kind of the founders come from a consulting background, as we'll dive into. But before we dive in, do you want to kind of touch on any tidbits that caught your eye the past week?
Yeah, so unless you were living on a rock in another galaxy, we have a new president in the United States, and so there has been a lot of talks about tariffs. And I read a Wall Street Journal report that talked about how, despite all of this attempt to say let's decouple from China and let's not do anything, that there is a trade surplus of $1 trillion between China and the rest of the world. That means that they're selling $1 trillion more per year than they're importing. And you say, okay, that's really big. Well, what's the trend? Well, that is 3 times what it was in 2018 when all of these tariffs were started. And so, just to throw some numbers at you, China produces the most cars, a third of all apparel, a third of all electronics, a fifth of machinery, and 80% of solar panels. And it's really interesting because both the US and the EU have recently taken up policies to make Chinese exports less attractive. And other emerging countries like Pakistan and India and Indonesia started to put their own barriers in place to protect their own industries as they're trying to industrialize. But it's just really interesting that despite all of this talk, we are now buying more collectively as a world from China than we were before the tariffs kicked off in 2018. Now, the Chinese economy still has lots of headwinds when it comes to investment and demographics and things like that, but it is very different than the picture that's maybe painted on the news channels today.
Yeah, it's pretty wild if you look at the numbers. And I mean, I think, like you said, the US and the EU have done a lot to kind of try to combat and kind of de-incentivize some imports from China in certain categories, like in particular cars. I mean, if you go to China and different parts of Asia, like the majority of vehicles, of course, are made in China throughout Asia. And it's just pretty staggering to see. And there's a lot of pretty cool auto technology that's come out of, BYD and some of these, large car manufacturers there that we really don't have exposure to in America or the EU for the most part. So I think it's a really fascinating statistic that you brought up today.
Do you think that the Trump administration will be successful in turning the tide of this, or do you think it's going to just be more expensive, but we still have this $1 trillion trade surplus or deficit?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, right? I think Trump in general in the past has used tariffs as a way to try to kind of combat and try to push businesses to import from other places besides China. Has that worked? Has that worked based on the numbers? No. But, at the same time, I think people need to understand who actually pays for these tariffs. In large part, it's just American businesses, American consumers that pay for the tariff. And so though, a lot of brands and companies try to pivot their supply chain and move outside of China, that can't be done overnight. And so it's really just, I think, this dynamic that a lot of day-to-day consumers don't quite understand. And I think in general, just the way global trade works, I think, you know, tariffs are not a great tool to de-incentivize kind of trade from a specific country. I mean, in large part, those companies that import from China are going to continue to do that until they have incentives to move their supply chain elsewhere to offset the cost of doing so, right? So, in part, tariffs can help with that, but I don't think it's going to be like really the pivotal point that enables companies to move most of the production outside of China is what I'm getting to.
I think you're right. I mean, the reality is that even if your factory is in Mexico, for most components, your supply chain is still going to run through China.
Yeah, 100%. And so I think it's a really interesting statistic that you brought up. What caught my eye being here in Utah, crumble cookies has been just taking over the cookie world, if you will. They are reportedly doing $1 billion in revenue across 1,000 franchises, about 150 million in
Wow.
profit. They started in 2017. The average franchise is about 1.1 million and about 125K in profit. I think in general, in my opinion, these kind of businesses go through different fads and phases. Like I grew up in the DC area where Georgetown Cupcakes was like a huge hit when I was growing up, and now I mean I think that brand and business is still around, but it's not nearly at the scale that it used to be. And so I mean they're exploring a sale at a reportedly $2 billion, which I think would be just incredibly rich, given how most of these businesses go. But the fact of the matter, to have 1,000 plus locations and to be doing $1 billion in revenue, it is just an incredible achievement. And I don't know if you had crumble cookies before. They are, if you have a sweet tooth, they're pretty good, but they're
They're very
very, very
sweet. They're
rich.
very sweet. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I think you go and they come in what, three or six or something like that. And I kind of want half of one until I have too much. But over 10x profit. That's aggressive. We'll see what happens because that could be a really good indicator for how M&A is coming back. And everything that I keep talking to with folks and hearing from investors is that the big companies are going to be coming back to the M&A board kind of the end of the 2025, early 2026. And so maybe the window's right and they'll get that valuation.
Yeah, yeah, we'll see what happens. And I mean, look, if you compare them to like Aunt Annie's or some of these other, global brands in these kind of fast food orientation category, like, they've got a lot of room to grow. So we'll see how it goes. I mean, you don't see them in malls across America yet, right? So we'll see where it goes. But
Sure.
today, I mean, I think this story is pretty fascinating. Aurate is just a really cool brand. It kind of, I guess, originally started from one of the founders wearing a piece of jewelry that kind of rubbed off green on her finger, and it led to this kind of iconic creation of this D2C brand. Do you want to talk about the founding story to start?
Yeah, so we'll introduce our first co-founder, and her name is Sophie Kahn, and she was originally from Amsterdam, and she was always very interested in business. She was selling cookies, although not crumble cookies, to family members and friends growing up. And when she was 18, she visited New York and decided that that's where she was going to live. And this kind of is good insight into her as a person. But she made a list of all the things that she would need to do in order to achieve being able to live in New York. And she was kind of drawn to the creative world, the fashion, things like that. But she was encouraged to study economics. And the advice was really that if she wanted to get into fashion, it was much better to go at it from a business side versus trying to be a designer. And so that's what she did. And she studied economics at the University of Amsterdam. And then she moved to Princeton, where she got a master's in finance. And Princeton's not too far away. And so she spent kind of every weekend she could up in New York and just really fell in love with the city. And it was while she was at Princeton that she met her eventual co-founder, Bukra Ezrahoy, who was in the same program. And Bukra is interesting in her own right. She was originally born in Morocco to a family of entrepreneurs. And she kind of knew that she wanted to start her own venture from an early day in her career.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting here is it's not like your typical dropped out of college to start this idea type of story, right? I mean, they both had significant professional careers before getting into Orate, right? So Bukra went into finance with Goldman Sachs. Sophie went to Boston Consulting Group. And, Sophie really actually started focusing on the fashion industry. So in her consulting experience, she, started working with Marc Jacobs, really kind of became attracted to their business. And this was when Marc Jacobs was, growing quite a bit. And at BCG, they have something called an externship where you can basically, kind of work within a company full time and get a comparable salary as if you're working at that company full time. And if you want to work with them full time, you can be placed there. They can hire you from BCG as a consultant. And so she learned a ton of different aspects about Marc Jacobs in the industry, and that's really kind of, I think, where she found her calling from a career standpoint. And this is kind of where Orate comes into play.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about her time at Marc Jacobs was this was the reason that Marc Jacobs was growing so quickly at the time was because they were taking really premium luxury handbags and they were making them more mass. They were lowering the cost, making it more approachable. And so I think that came into the DNA of how they were thinking about this. But Aurate really comes into fruition with a chance lunch that Bukra and Sophie had. They were catching up one day in 2014, and Bukra had bought a ring from a well-known brand, but it had a discount, and there was a defect with it. And as you mentioned, this ring made her finger turn green. And they kind of got to complaining about this. Said, we both have really good salaries. I work for Goldman, you work for BCG. We can barely afford this jewelry, and even when we get to buy it, it's just absolute crap, and it feels like we're overpaying for it. And so, being the finance and consulting folks that they are, they went through and thought through and said, okay, well, how do we dissect the industry? What do we look here? Well, the first thing they said, well, this market's ripe for disruption because this price to quality ratio is off, and there's just no sustainability in the actual jewelry itself. So that was number one. Number two, from a brand perspective, they felt that there really weren't any brands that were talking to them as millennial women. Most of the brands were still talking to men who were buying jewelry for women, but nothing was really about women, buying jewelry for themselves. And the third part was in the mid 2010s. This was kind of peak Facebook, peak D2C, and they saw the success of Warby Parker and others. And they said, maybe we should do something like this in the jewelry space. And so that's kind of why they ultimately decided to start investigating jewelry in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super interesting. I kind of want to double click here, right? Because, so many people have been at lunch or dinner with their friend and said, hey, oh, I've got this problem, or hey, why don't we do this? And they don't do anything with it, right? And so I think it really speaks to who these co-founders are in terms of, they were catching up over lunch, they started talking about jewelry, they realized, hey, the kind of price and quality ratio isn't matching up with the products that I'm buying. I've got this kind of allure to jewelry and I'm really into these type of products. And I think at the same time, they saw D2C taking off with the likes of Warby Parker at the time growing quite a bit. And they realized, we should do something about this. And so I think it really speaks to who they are as founders in terms of, seeing kind of a problem that they resonated and connected with, and then making something out of nothing, really, right? Because neither of them had, direct experience in jewelry or D2C. And Marc Jacobs, I mean, yeah, it's an incredible and very well respected brand, but it's not like a D2C upstart brand here, right?
No, you're absolutely right. And I kind of want to come back to what you said about, these conversations that they were having. I'm sure this was not the only conversation they had about something that was wrong in their life they thought could be better. Because these are just smart women that are dissecting the world in a particular way. And they were thinking about this. And so I think it's, I'm reminded of a conversation I had a couple years ago with a friend who works for a bank. And he's like, you know what? We need to get into like space manufacturing. Like that's going to be a huge thing. Being able to make fiber optic cables and those sort of things, like that's where there's going to be a lot of money. And he was right; it's a good idea. But I was like, well, why are we the ones to go out and do this? Like, I've never been to space. I've worked in a tea factory. I haven't made fiber optic cables, but I think there's this element of just because you have an idea doesn't mean that you are the right person to execute it. And so I'm curious to say, why did they feel that they would be the ones that could pull this off?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they believe in their ability to learn, right? So they felt that they were the target demo for this, and they signed up for jewelry classes on the weekends, right? And so they took, I think, 6 months of classes at Parsons, which is like a big design school in New York, and they learned all about jewelry on the weekends. And so for a full year, Sophie did, both her job at Marc Jacobs as well as working at her new company Aurate, and they both decided to go full time in 2016. And so I think they kind of eased their way into this and kind of built confidence and built that ability to just go all in, right? Because she wasn't like, hey, I'm going to quit my job at Marc Jacobs and just go all in on this. I'm going to ease my way in, learn about the industry, learn about the process of actually making jewelry, and see, is this something I'm going to be able to do?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like they went through and they tried to de-risk their ability to understand it. How do they go about de-risking the idea?
Yeah, I love this part of their story, right? So, I think in today's world of e-commerce, we probably hear about it more, but back in like 2016 when they were starting, I think very few brands were doing this, but they had a pop-up store in Soho They basically, put together some IKEA tables and they tested their products, in real life with people, right? It wasn't like they were putting up some Facebook ad and seeing, hey, is this going to convert? They, really just had a pop up and they sold everything they had in a couple of days. And this kind of, I think, furthered their validation of, hey, there's something here. And they really liked the idea of testing in retail because they were able to gather data on what resonated, right away, listening to people kind of shop with their friends, right in front of them, and learn about, what resonated with their demographic. And so it was a really kind of trial and error process of trying to understand, okay, what customers resonated with what designs and what they really kind of wanted in terms of messaging. And this led to them in 2017 raising their seed round of funding from friends and family. And they use this to open up more pop-up stores and start, initial online presence, and hire their initial team. So I just love this kind of concept of going to test in person. And, I think it really resonates because you don't see it too often, right? I mean, most people are like, oh, let's just, put up a website and launch some ads and see if it's going to work. And, no, they actually, had a little pop-up store and that's how they tested this.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, so many people look today as like, oh, having a store, like one day we'll have a store, one day we'll do this. And I like the fact that they just said, look, let's try it for a couple of weeks. Let's rent a space. Let's put up a sign that says Aurate and see where we end up. And I think it's so important that founders are willing to put in that sweat equity, whether it be a store, whether it be getting on the phone with customers. I know that when I was starting ISBA, we were living in New Jersey at the time, just across from New York City, and I would go in and be in the city for 12 hours a day, just trying to talk to as many people as I could. And I, kind of funny looking back in retrospect, but I was so frugal at the time that I would take the bus in and I would pay for one subway ride downtown and I would walk back. Would be kind of, I would plan like where I was going, and if I had a good interaction or good meeting with someone, maybe I would get lunch. But otherwise, like I'm eating peanut butter and jelly or sandwiches or stuff like that. But I think that there's an element here that every founder has to be willing to go through some period of just actual grit out, things that don't scale. And this was a very interesting way that they went about and did it.
Yeah, I love it. I really do. And I think, what they derived was kind of similar to larger DTC brands that we see today, like Majuri that we've covered in the past on e-commerce on tap. A really, really amazing episode. But, their go-to-market strategy is quite different, right?
Yeah, it is. So for one, their products aren't cheap, but they're also approachable, which I think is exactly where they wanted to fit. And if you look on their website today, their rings will cost you around $200. Necklaces will be anywhere from $700 to $3,000. So not something that you're just going to purchase on Temu, and if it doesn't work, you throw it away. You're going to think about this purchase a little bit more. But it's also not a $100,000 necklace that's coming out. Their go to market is their products are really oriented around selling to women, and so this motif of buy yourself the necklace instead of having a man buy you a necklace, which is very similar to Majuri's ethos and brand that's out there. The company sells everything from rings, necklaces, earrings, bracelets, anklets, and other accessories. And they do a lot of their aesthetic can be described as quietly luxurious or minimalistic. And they seem to have a very retail first approach, even though they're a D2C company. And so we talked about the pop-up store they leveraged, and they felt that this was so good because it was giving them all of the consumer insight faster than if it was D2C. So imagine just being there and listening to the conversation going on, seeing what people are picking up or not picking up, seeing what people are considering, seeing what people think about the price, seeing what's actually moving, and being able to get all of that information in real time is really powerful. And when you start to think about just the industry and that 80% of all jewelry sales are done in retail, it makes sense, even if their revenue doesn't come from this, but their roots were firmly rooted in retail.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, I didn't even know that 80% of jewelry sales are done in retail. That seems, a lot higher than most industries. But it makes sense, right? You want to touch, feel, see how it looks on you. And it kind of makes me question, like, are they a retail brand or are they a D2C brand, right? Kind of go back and forth. And I
It's a
think,
good question.
if you look at their kind of brand today, it's definitely a D2C, makes up their majority and they're considered a D2C brand. But they had a number of stores across U.S. metro areas between 2022 and 2023 those stores have since closed, and they haven't, reopened their own branded stores. But Sophie was quoted saying that it made the most sense to quote partner with retailers that know what they're doing when getting back into brick and mortar. So it sounds like they'll probably go more of a distribution route in the future. But and this proved to be true when in 2023 they decided to enter their wholesale business, partnering with Helzberg Diamonds and Macy's. And I didn't know this, but Helzberg
They're
accounts
big.
for accounts for roughly 10% of all U.S. jewelers, and jewelry accounts for 40% of Macy's revenue, which equates to about 1.7 billion. I mean, did you know that Macy's sold 1.7 billion in jewelry? That's pretty
Well, I
remarkable.
think it's 1.7 billion of revenue, but 40% of that comes from jewelry, but still a really big number.
Okay. Either way, I mean, 40% of 1.7 billion, that's like 500 mil or 600 million. So quite a bit.
Yeah, I thought Macy's just had the parade, and in New York they had the couches that I used to take naps on up on like the 10th or 11th floor. But I guess they sell jewelry too.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of a different approach in some sense because they now partner with these massive players to kind of, I guess, not have their own branded stores. But, does this dilute their D2C brand in some sense? What are your thoughts there?
I would say for most brands it could, because if you are selling the exact same thing on D2C and you're selling it, in retail, there's kind of a question of, well, does everybody want it D2C, or since 80% of all sales are coming from retail, is that where it's going to flock to? I think what Aurate did was really smart in the way that they went to retail, and what they did with Heltzberg and Macy's is that they created very customized co-marketing playbooks for each brand, which included an exclusive collection for the retailer. And so they used this and they said, okay, we've got these sister companies, we're going to split up the marketing responsibilities, and they were able to be really symbiotic. And so, for example, Orate helped Heltzberg with influencer marketing and just digital presence and things like that. That's something that a 108-year-old company probably is not going to be very good at. And so they found a lot of value in there, in addition to just a sales channel, to help them do a little bit better. And so I think they were similar enough that the brand could resonate and could be there and be recognized, but at the same time, it wasn't the exact same thing, so they didn't commoditize or cannibalize their DC business. I think the other part too is that who they partner with was really important, because Heltzberg's jewelers are typically in places where their customers are not from a D2C point of view. Right? It's very New York centric, very large city concentrated, where Heltzberg is middle America. It's all over the place. And so this helps them to branch out and get exposure to a different type of clientele that they normally wouldn't have. And I think the last thing that these partnerships allowed them to do was to test and expand the use of vermeil. And vermeil is a silver jewelry with a gold coating on top of it. And this allows them to hit the price targets they have, because silver is generally much cheaper than gold, but it still holds up and it gives you that quality, that punch that they're looking for. And so that's been one of the things that they've been most known for.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, one of the things that sticks out to me, and I was just the other day with the founder of Just Ingredients, which is, a high growth CPG brand here based in Utah. And they just got distribution in Whole Foods and Sprouts. And they were saying that in order for them to make sense of selling through distributors who then, place their products in these large, retailers like Whole Foods, they actually have different SKUs that they developed for these retailers. And so that kind of seems like it's, a little bit of a similar strategy here in terms of not wanting to compete directly with your prices on your website, with the retailer when your, net margin is going to be lower because there's, distributors and wholesale pricing and all of that. And so it sounds like Ori kind of had a similar approach with some of their, retail partners here, which, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, people do that with Amazon too, where, if I've got a 12-ounce bottle of something, either I'll make a 16-ounce bottle to sell on Amazon, or I'll start to bundle, because Amazon's particularly tricky because they will go out and scrape and want the lowest price. And so if it's $20 on your website and it's $21 on Amazon, well, guess what? they're not going to give you the buy box. And so they're pretty aggressive that way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one thing that kind of stood out to me in Orate's journey as well was they experimented with a subscription model. And so they kind of thought that consumers, wanted to touch and try their jewelry before committing to a purchase. And so they launched Orate Curate in 2018. And basically what it was is customers would go on their website, fill out a questionnaire, and kind of Aurate would use a mix of algorithms to understand, what jeweler would best match their style. And they would send the jewelry to the consumer's home where they could keep the box for a week and kind of try it on and see what fit them best. And, do that before either returning it or purchasing it. And they only charge $1 for the box, which they returned when they got back. So I thought it was pretty kind of innovative, you know, model at the time in terms of kind of try before you buy type of subscription, which makes a lot of sense for their business, especially if you think about that statistic that 80% of jewelry is bought in store, so people really want to kind of feel it and try it on before they make a purchase.
Yeah, and if you look today, this doesn't exist, so they quietly shut it down. What do you think they learned from trying something like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, right? I think partially probably they had logistic challenges in terms of understanding, the return rates and all of that and kind of just sorting through returns. I mean, just from a 3PL perspective, that's pretty complex. I think that's number one in terms of the logistical challenges. I also think cash flow challenges when I think about try before you buy, right? You're kind of sending out your inventory without getting paid for it, and then, hopefully getting some of that back through actual purchases. So they kind of those are two things that come to mind, I guess, from a business standpoint. I think from a consumer standpoint, maybe it just didn't prove as successful in terms of them spending money to acquire a customer that then kind of went through this trial purchase of try before you buy, and maybe it just kind of the back end math didn't work out there. So I don't know. I mean, it's interesting that they shut this program off.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I thought of was just like fraud, right? Like, if you're buying $1,000 necklace or borrowing it for a week, I mean, in theory, you have it for a week, you got to send it back. If you're, how many times did somebody send something else back and it took some time for them to go through it? Just the back and forth of, hey, you charged my credit card. I don't want this. Like, give me a refund now. Like, that just seemed like it was probably more headache than it was worth. And when I was doing some other research on it, they said, like, we got rid of this and people kept coming back. And the subscription is nice. It's a good traditional SaaS metric to look at. But the big thing was just that, people buy jewelry at a different cadence. I mean, I buy it annually, maybe at most. It seems like whenever I do these episodes. But other people may buy it more frequently or less frequently, and so it's hard to have a subscription that fits most people and something that you know they got to remember and oh yeah, here's this thing. So I think it's a good idea in theory. I'm glad that they tested it out, but it felt like they were really feeling their way out before they ultimately landed on this Heltzberg and Macy strategy, which seems to be doing really well for them.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Well, let's talk through kind of their financial milestones a bit. So 2015, they get the idea, they begin testing things out. This is kind of when that initial launch happens, when they start doing pop-up stores. 2017, they, really go full time. They raise $2.6 million in a seed round. 2019, they raised a Series A for $13 million, led by Blue Crest Capital Management, with other investors including Point King Capital, Drake Management, and AAF Management. 2020, they announced they became profitable for the first time. And then in 2023, they announced a Series B, raising $25 million. Revenue figures, have not been disclosed at all for the company. I mean, if you go out and raise a $25 million Series B, you'd estimate you're doing like, at least 50, maybe 75 million a year in revenue. But we don't know. That's what we're estimating. But I mean, you would think that, for a DTC brand to raise $25 million in a Series B, they've got to be in that ballpark, at least tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I thought was really interesting about how they chose to come to market is they've been very frugal and wanted a good positive unit economics to begin with. And I read somewhere that they had always talked about when they did advertising on Facebook and Meta, that they only wanted that to account for about 20% of their traffic, and the others needed to be, um, word of mouth, organic, things like that. What were some of the unique partnerships that they've had that helped them do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a few different celebrities that got involved with the brand over the years, right? So Kerry Washington, she actually invested in the company, has been pretty active in the business. I think she was really, drawn to the mission of helping making fine jewelry more accessible. Meghan Markle, wasn't a formal partnership, but she's regularly been seen wearing the Aurate necklace. And others like, Kate Upton and Jessica Biel have been, photographed wearing their pieces as well. So pretty cool just to see that, they've been able to tap into this kind of celebrity demographic and hopefully, driven some sales through that. But, a lot of them have not been kind of formal partnerships, outside of Kerry Washington, which, has been an investor in the company too. So, I mean, it's pretty remarkable what they've done to be able to tap into that audience, right? I think, product placement with celebrities is always kind of a mystery in some sense, but, it's been awesome, I guess, to see them, get that placement. What about, their supply chain? I mean, what kind of stood out from you from that perspective?
Yeah, so again, they've really been focused on vertical integration. They want to keep low amounts of inventory, and they want to keep their prices low. I wouldn't, again, I wouldn't call $3,000 necklace low, but they want to keep them lower than where they could be. And so they've done a lot. They've actually talked quite a bit about using data, using customer insights to improve how quickly they're able to come up with new things, how they're able to keep inventory low. And Bukra actually even developed like a proprietary math model that helps figure out, how viral something could be going, what the inventory level should be. I think it's interesting that with a company like Majuri, they've taken a perspective of scarcity, and they have these drops all the time, and they intentionally, leave money on the table because that brings people to come back. Uh, Aurate has come at it a different way, and they're kind of known for something a little different, which comes back to that vermeil, right? That gold coated silver, and that has been how they've been able to strike the right balance between cost and perception. They don't have nearly as many drops as say Majuri does, but they have a loyal and recurring customer base that come in and look at things. I think one of the things that's really interesting about Aurate is how they source their precious metals, and they were very keen on sustainability from the beginning, and so much so that all of the gold that they use is recycled, meaning that they don't get it directly from a mine, but rather from other jewelry that's been melted down, recycled, reclaimed, things like that. They say that all their diamonds are conflict free. They follow the Kimberley process we talked about in the first episode of the season, and so it's really interesting that way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they really have a sustainability focus here. I mean, they talk about, kind of, I mean, they even share their sourcing information on their website, right? Which is pretty cool that not a lot of brands do. And they source kind of from all over the world, right? I mean, in Mexico, they get some gold and diamonds. Turkey, they talk about getting gold. They also list out the certifications that they have, so multiple ISO certificates. India, they've got stones and gems. They also mentioned kind of different lab grown diamond that they potentially use, which is interesting. We did a pretty deep dive on lab grown in an episode, which was a lot of fun. And Thailand, they've got casting and finishing of silver and gold. Vietnam, plating. China, gold and ethical diamonds, and they talk about GIA and IGI certifications that are specifically mentioned on their products. And then in Japan, they source pearls. So really diverse supply chain. I think it's interesting because they talk about their different diverse sources for their products around the world. And if you kind of cross reference that with their shipments, you can't really track the level of detail that they explain in their supply chain. But most of the shipments that we see from their import records are coming from China and Taiwan. So maybe it's that they're not the importer of record on their shipments from these other countries, or there's a lot of reasons that could explain that. But just really interesting to see how transparent they are with their supply chain. I respect that.
Yeah. I'm just curious, since you have so much jewelry manufacturing experience, what are some of the unique things that you've seen that maybe they're leveraging in a factory?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, in the introductory episode, we did a deep dive on jewelry production and how jewelry is made and all the different methods of jewelry production. And I mean, most of my jewelry sourcing experience that stems from China and India. So in India, you've got so much uniqueness. You've got kind of all those really just standout pieces, right? I mean, I always say in India, not everything is always made the same, right? And so it's really interesting to see in China, you've got a lot of kind of that die cast or plating type of experience when it comes to manufacturing. And I think people would be kind of surprised slash shocked to see how some of the jewelry is made in these factories. And, in general, it's not as kind of hands-on as most people think when you talk about plating and just kind of the whole process. I mean, it really is machine driven at this scale.
Mm.
But when you look at India for their stones and gems, it is really hands-on and it's a different dynamic there. So I mean, I think it depends what kind of jewelry we're talking about. Obviously with Aurate, they've got a lot of really unique pieces. So I think that's why they blend in such a global supply chain here, because they need to get, pearls from different places around the world, or these different gems. So I think in general, their manufacturing process is probably quite a bit different than your typical,
Mm.
stamp and press type of process. Because if you look at their jewelry on their website, they do have a lot of unique pieces there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, kind of sticking with the international thread here, despite having a global supply chain, they have kind of deprioritized international sales despite having a founder from Europe and another founder from the Middle East. So a couple of years ago, they talked about how only about 10% of their sales were outside the United States. I'm just curious, why do you think they've deprioritized international?
I think it has to do with logistics and inventory planning, right? I mean, I think in general, e-commerce is a balance of cash flow. And if you're trying to sell internationally to have a great experience with that, typically you need to hold your inventory overseas, right? To have a great, shipping time for your customers there, whether they be in Europe or Australia or wherever it may be. So I think it's probably a matter of logistics in terms of, where do they want to keep their inventory. So I think that probably is the reason why. And I think just focusing on a market, America is a huge market for jewelry. There's definitely a lot of room for them to grow here. And so I think they probably feel like there's a lot more that they could do here before expanding internationally.
I'd agree with that. I think that part of this too is strategic, where if they expand internationally too early and they don't do it well, when they're looking for an acquisition, people are like, "Oh, well, you've already vetted this out; it doesn't work." Whereas if it's there and it's a potential, you can kind of sell the dream or sell the idea, and that can help push the valuation up.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. What about from a exit standpoint? You just mentioned valuation. What do you think Orate stands from a exit standpoint?
Yeah, so really interesting. So if you look at this and just try to be objective, assuming they were first profitable in 2020, assuming they're still profitable today, that's a first big check mark. The second thing is they didn't raise that much venture capital. They could have raised, oh gosh, imagine if they raised $100 million, $200 million. They're going to be looking for an exit that's much higher than what it is. Where they raised, what was it, 30 some million. So their exit window is a little bit better, where they could potentially exit for 200 to 300, and that would be a great outcome for those investors versus needing to exit for a billion or 2 billion. And the last part is they've built out a strong executive team. And when they did their Series B, they actually talked about how a good chunk of those proceeds were going to uh, either hire or promote C-suite members. So they brought in some CMOs, COO, CFO, and they basically kind of had this C-suite, this professional managers come in. And then what's interesting is that Sophia and Bukra actually stepped away from the business. And so if you look on their LinkedIn, Sophie is back at BCG where she's now a partner. So it looks like she took an externship with Aurate and then went back. And Bukra is a managing director at a Web 3.0 company. And so they've kind of stepped away, but the business is there, and I assume doing well. And so it's kind of an interesting piece here where they've set this thing up to sell, but assuming it's profitable, it doesn't have to sell right away. It can continue to grow, and maybe it's growing at 5 or 10% a year, and that's good enough. It doesn't have to be 90%, especially if they control their own destiny.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, obviously the big check mark is, are they profitable or not? Um, you know, I think they probably continue their path to profitability in 2020, so they probably are still profitable. I'm curious. I mean, what do you think about the founders stepping away? Right? Is that a good or bad thing, or what do you think that dynamic looks like?
It's a mixed bag, right? So I think that on one hand, if you're looking to sell your business, you're going to want to step away from that business at some point, right? I don't want to sell my business to Procter and Gamble and then have to work there for 15 years and not be the boss. And so, to some extent, every founder will step away from their business. And so, you have to be able to build the right culture, the right incentive structure, the right processes so that it's not dependent on the founder. And so, from one aspect, like it makes sense that they've done that because now this is more of a battle tested company that an acquirer knows who they're getting. They know that they're getting. They know that it's not dependent on a single person. You think about Bobby Brown or Charlotte Tilbury or some of those cosmetics companies that are built around a person. That's very difficult to sell the company, and then what do you do with that person? Are they in charge? No, like those are difficult. I think on the other hand, though, anytime you have founders who said, you know what, I'm not going to do this thing because I think there's a better opportunity over here, that can only be taken as a vote of less confidence to some extent because they're moving on. They've sold their shares, in a secondary, and they're ready to move on. I don't fault them. I think that more founders probably need to become a little bit less attached to their businesses and look at these things as, this is a distinct period of my life. I'm going to give 100%. But just because I started something doesn't mean I have to be with it for, the next 80 years and I have to will it into existence. You can start something. It can be, helpful for you. You can learn a lot, and then you can transition to something else, and that's okay. So I think you can see either example in this one.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think on Sophie's profile, right, on her LinkedIn, it still mentions she's a board member, so I'm sure she's involved in some regard. And I think, look, they ran Aurate for, I think it was a total of like 9 or 10 years, is that right? So,
Yeah.
they were in the weeds for a long time, right? And we both know as founders that is a lot of work, a lot of stress, and typically, a lot of travel. And so I think it comes a time as a founder where you're ready to step outside the day to day. And, you talk about working in the business versus on the business, right? And so I think, I think they're both probably involved to an extent working on the business rather than in the business. And, I think that sets them up for more success as well as for the business, right? Because I think sometimes if you're in the weeds for too long, you don't come out for breath. You don't even realize where you're at and where you're heading, right? And so I think it is a different dynamic to step outside the box. And, I know even from my experience, running and starting Sourcify and now partnering with ISBA, it's enabled me to, I think bigger and, understand where our growth opportunities are more and where we fell short in the past, right? So I think it's a really interesting dynamic to have that experience exiting as a founder and, being able to hopefully see the business to the next level. So I think, I think Orate has a lot of growth ahead. I would be really curious to see kind of where their revenue falls, right? It's hard to estimate best based on just fundraising numbers alone. But I mean, I really enjoyed this story, and I think it really kind of just coincides well with our theme of this season of jewelry.
Yeah, I agree, and we've become a bit more jewelry experts ourselves as we've been digging into these companies, and I'm curious to know from our listeners: is it good or bad if a founder steps away from a business? Like net positive, net negative? Leave a comment in on the YouTube comments, and we'd be happy to get back to you.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, we appreciate everyone tuning into this episode of E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. Please leave a review, share with a friend. We greatly appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.